She was born into a silence that smelled of dust and decay. No photographs, no letters, no whispers about the man who had given her life. Only rumors, spoken in the hushed tones of those who dared not name him, because naming him might call forth the darkness that lingered just out of sight. Her mother never told her who he was. Perhaps she didn't know herself. Perhaps she had learned, too late, that some truths are corrosive, that some bloodlines are meant to be forgotten. The town she grew up in looked ordinary from the outside. Faded clapboard houses, lawns struggling to survive against the relentless summer sun, and a church whose steeple pierced the sky like a moral compass, though it had long stopped pointing anywhere meaningful. But inside the walls of her home, the air was thick with unspoken things, family photos carefully arranged, yet never showing the man who should have been at the center, birth certificates tucked away like secrets. Conversations ending abruptly when her father's absence was hinted at, and slowly, as she grew, she began to notice patterns in her own reflection, features that didn't belong, a resemblance that should have been impossible. The whispers began innocuously enough. Schoolmates, oblivious to the devastation they were naming, remarked on how unusual her looks were. She had the same sharp nose and heavy, lidded eyes as the mother she loved, but there were subtleties no one could explain. The way the jawline shifted like an echo from a face that didn't exist, the way her skin seemed almost too pale in certain light, as though carrying a shadow from another era. Children tease what they do not understand, and they teased her mercilessly. She learned to retreat into the small, dark corners of her home, reading old newspapers, examining genealogical records, tracing every surname and birth date she could find. Her mother's story was fragmented. She claimed the father had vanished before the child's birth, leaving behind nothing but a letter she burned before the girl's eyes, a letter she never explained, a letter whose ash smelled faintly of betrayal. But she had not disappeared entirely. Bits of the truth seeped through cracks. An uncle who glanced at her with a mixture of fear and recognition, a cousin who avoided eye contact as though the very act might summon a curse. And then there were the town's secrets too, families who had intermarried for generations, whispers of inbreeding that no one spoke of openly, marriages that carried not love, but the binding of blood. It was only as she reached the edge of adulthood that the shadows began to solidify. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Her medical records suggested a higher than average risk for genetic complications. Doctors hinted at hereditary conditions without explaining them fully, their discomfort betraying a knowledge they weren't permitted to share, and her own mirror became an adversary. She would study herself for hours, mapping her features against family portraits, identifying similarities that should have been impossible, the kind that suggested a lineage more twisted than she could have imagined. Her mother's confessions came slowly, almost unwillingly. In a trembling voice one night, she admitted the truth she had buried beneath decades of shame and fear. Her daughter had been conceived not in love, not in the casual violence of neglect, but in something far darker, an act that would today be labeled unspeakable, yet at the time was shrouded in denial and secrecy. Her father was, in fact, her mother's brother, or perhaps a more distant relative, but close enough that the implications were horrifying. The mother had convinced herself it was an accident, a single indiscretion, but as she spoke, it was clear she had known from the start that the child's life would be forever entwined with the shadows of her family. The girl, now a woman, felt a dissonance in herself she could not reconcile. Every interaction with the town, every casual glance in the mirror, became a reminder of the inheritance she could not undo. She wondered if her very existence was a message, a warning buried in flesh, a warning that some truths should not travel through generations, and yet she could not escape them. She was the living proof of her family's hidden sins, a testament to the consequences of silence. Night after night, she would wander the empty halls of the old family home, imagining the life she might have had if the father had been someone else, if the mother had chosen differently, if history itself had rewritten the rules for her. But history was indifferent. It allowed the dark patterns of bloodlines to persist, quietly, invisibly, while the rest of the world looked elsewhere. And as she traced her ancestry, branch by branch, she realized the horrifying possibility that she was not the anomaly, but the inevitable result of generations who had ignored their own warnings. Her awakening to this reality was not sudden. It was incremental, each revelation worse than the last. A family Bible with pages missing, a distant cousin confessing under the influence of drink that things used to be different, a local historian warning her to stop digging or risk finding things better left buried. Each fragment chipped away at the version of herself she had known, until the reflection staring back in the mirror was no longer just hers. It belonged to every ancestor who had participated in the unspoken pact that produced her. And yet she carried on, not out of defiance, but necessity. Knowledge, even of the most grotesque kind, demanded confrontation. To ignore it would be to live a lie stitched with the same blood that had haunted generations before her. Slowly, she began to document what she had learned, noting the dates, the marriages, the disappearances, the quiet disappearances of those who might have spoken. She began to map the genealogy like an archaeologist digging in a tomb, each layer revealing more than she wanted to know: repeated unions, shadowed children, hidden illnesses, and the stubborn endurance of secrecy itself. By the time she reached the age when others married, had children, and looked toward a future, she realized she could never do the same. Her DNA carried too many echoes of the past. Every relationship she considered was filtered through the lens of ancestry, of unspoken bonds, of a bloodline too tightly wound around itself. She was alone in a way that the outside world could not comprehend. And yet, there was a grim fascination in that solitude, a recognition that she embodied a story that no one else dared tell aloud. Her life became a study in shadows. The walls of her home were lined with notebooks, photographs, and genetic charts, each one a testament to a lineage that should have ended generations before. She traced her own features against those of her mother, her uncles, her distant cousins, cataloging every similarity with a precision that bordered on obsession. And in those comparisons, she found both terror and understanding. The understanding that history, especially the personal kind, is rarely kind or neat. It leaves scars, marks, and in some cases, entire lives defined by the sins of the past. The townspeople never knew the extent of her knowledge. They saw only a quiet, unusual woman who kept to herself. They commented on her beauty, her sharp features, her intelligence, never realizing that every compliment carried a hidden irony, a resonance with a past they were too polite or too afraid to acknowledge. And in that silence, she found a kind of power, the power of someone who knows the truth while everyone else remains blind, the power of a witness to a crime not of law, but of blood. Her story is not unique. Across the country, in small towns and forgotten valleys, similar patterns exist, buried beneath polite conversation and unmarked graves. Families who believed that the past could be erased, that sins committed in secrecy could remain hidden, have learned the hard way that genetics has a memory. Blood remembers, children remember even when they do not know why, and in some cases that remembrance is a slow, quiet horror, one that arrives without warning and refuses to leave. The woman who never knew her father lived her life as a guardian of secrets she could not speak aloud. Every relationship she formed, every conversation she had, was filtered through the knowledge of what she carried inside her. And in that knowledge there was both anguish and clarity, anguish for the life that might have been, clarity in understanding that she was, in every sense, a living archive of the consequences of hidden sins. In the end, she understood that some histories are meant to be discovered only by those who are willing to face them. And as she stared into the mirror one last time before leaving for a walk through the fading town, she saw not just herself, but the accumulation of generations who had tried, and failed, to hide from what they had done. The woman, the daughter, the heir of a twisted bloodline, realized that while she could never change the past, she could bear witness to it. And bearing witness, she knew, was sometimes the only way to survive. She had always wondered about the absence of certain faces at family gatherings, the way some chairs remained empty as if they had been reserved for ghosts. There were no photographs of her father, no stories, no anecdotes that could provide even the smallest clue to the man whose blood flowed through her veins. Her mother had spoken of him only in fragments, like broken glass that cut just by looking. Even then, she had couched the truth in euphemism, as though naming him aloud might summon him back from the shadows, or worse, draw the attention of neighbors who might whisper and judge. But fragments, as they often do, began to form a pattern, and the pattern was terrifying. It started with small, almost imperceptible details. A glance from an uncle that lingered too long, a cousin's sudden nervousness when certain topics arose, the way her mother's eyes would darken when genealogy was mentioned. These were not coincidences, they were signals, warnings, perhaps even confessions disguised as gestures. And in the quiet nights, when the house was still and the wind pressed its fingers against the windows, she would sift through these moments, piecing together what no one wanted her to know. By her late teens, she had begun to suspect something deeply unsettling about her origins. Certain traits that others dismissed as familial quirks, her unusually high cheekbones, the curve of her eyebrows, the precise symmetry of her features, seemed to echo back through generations in ways that defied logic. She pored over family trees, old letters, and public records, tracing the interconnections between her mother's side of the family and the men who had disappeared without explanation. The discoveries were subtle at first, barely perceptible, but as she went deeper, a pattern of incest emerged, a history carefully erased, quietly maintained for decades. The first time someone outside the family spoke the unthinkable aloud, she felt a shiver of recognition. A distant neighbor, emboldened by alcohol or madness, muttered about how bloodlines twist in these parts, mentioning names that aligned too closely with her own ancestry. It was not just gossip, it was a mirror held up to the past, reflecting truths no one had the courage to confront directly. In that reflection, she saw herself, and she realized with chilling clarity that her very existence was a consequence of choices so perverse, so secret, that the town had built its life around forgetting them. She confronted her mother one night, driven by a mixture of fear and longing for the truth. Her mother's confession came in a whisper, broken and trembling, as though each word threatened to shatter something vital. The man she had called father, or more accurately, the man whose absence had defined her life, was not merely unknown. He was related to her in ways that made her pulse quicken and her stomach turn. Generations of incest, carefully hidden and rationalized, had culminated in her. She was the product of a lineage that had blurred the lines of morality and legality, leaving her as both victim and unwitting heir to a family's dark obsession with its own blood. The realization was devastating. She withdrew from her friends, from casual relationships, from the normal rhythms of life that others took for granted. Every interaction with the outside world became filtered through the lens of ancestry. She could no longer look at herself in a mirror without seeing the accumulated weight of her bloodline. Each feature, each subtle trait, was a testament to decades of secrecy and taboo. And while she carried the physical evidence of her family's choices, she also bore the psychological burden, the knowledge that her identity, her very sense of self, had been shaped by acts most would consider monstrous. Her life became a study in isolation. She avoided romantic entanglements, terrified that any relationship might accidentally mirror the twisted patterns of her lineage. She spent hours documenting her family history, mapping out unions, births, and disappearances. The charts she created were meticulous, a latticework of forbidden truths. In those hours, she confronted a reality most would never dare to acknowledge, that families like hers existed in shadow, quietly repeating cycles of inbreeding, secrecy, and denial. It was during one of these long nights of research that she discovered a pattern she had not anticipated. The family, it seemed, had not merely repeated these unions. They had done so with intention, believing that by keeping blood pure, they could achieve something beyond understanding. She stared at the names and dates, noting each recurrence of certain surnames, and felt the weight of centuries pressing down on her. Each marriage, each hidden birth, was like a stitch in a dark tapestry that she had only just begun to see. The psychological impact was profound. She began to experience moments of dissociation, flashes where she felt both herself and a culmination of the women who had come before her. In these moments, the boundaries of her identity blurred. She could almost see the decisions made by her ancestors, feel the secrecy they had maintained, the shame and fear that had driven them to silence. It was as if the past was no longer a distant history but a living presence, coiling around her, shaping her every thought, every choice, every reflection in the mirror. She also began to notice the physical consequences of her ancestry. Minor health issues that doctors had attributed to chance or genetics alone suddenly made sense in context. A predisposition to certain conditions, subtle markers of inbreeding, signs that her body carried the literal imprint of generations who had repeated the same mistakes. Each symptom was a reminder that the past was not merely metaphorical. It lived in her, tangible and immutable, and yet, amid the horror, there was a strange clarity. In documenting and understanding her lineage, she achieved a sort of control over it. Knowledge became a shield, a way to assert some agency over a reality that had otherwise rendered her powerless. She began to write, not for publication, not for the world, but for herself, as a way to externalize the horrors she had inherited and to create a narrative in which she could finally observe, rather than be trapped by, her family's legacy. It was in this period of obsessive cataloging that she realized she was not alone. Other families in the region had histories that mirrored her own, hidden and unspoken. Entire towns carried the marks of secrecy, of intermarriage, of actions justified in silence. It was a network of shadows, a dark web of choices that had long been ignored by official history, by newspapers, by textbooks. And in realizing this, she saw herself not just as an individual haunted by her lineage, but as a witness to a broader, systemic horror that had been quietly shaping human lives for generations. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Her existence became a delicate balance between living and observing. Every interaction with family members, every family reunion or casual conversation, carried the risk of accidental revelation. People around her, ignorant of the truth she bore, could never know that she saw the hidden threads connecting each smile, each glance, each whispered word. She walked among them as both participant and chronicler, fully aware that her understanding of the world was darker, more precise than anyone else's. And as the years passed, she began to confront the most difficult truth of all, that her life, defined by the choices of those before her, might also define those who came after her. She had inherited more than just physical traits or genetic risk. She had inherited a responsibility to bear witness, to catalogue, and perhaps to prevent repetition where possible. Yet even as she considered this, she understood that some patterns were so entrenched that they might be impossible to break, that some secrets, once set in motion, were fated to reverberate across generations, unseen but always felt. Her journey was one of relentless inquiry, often at the expense of her own comfort and happiness. She became a historian of her own blood, a reluctant archivist of human behavior gone wrong. And in doing so, she discovered something paradoxical. While the truth was horrifying, it was also beautiful in its clarity. Every hidden fact, every secret act, every unspoken detail was a piece of a puzzle that only she had the courage or the curse to assemble. And in that assembly, she glimpsed the terrifying poetry of human lineage, that we are, each of us, the product of decisions we may never fully understand, and that some truths, no matter how dark, are worth facing because they illuminate the nature of existence itself. The truth she had uncovered was not just a story of one family, but a mirror into the depths of human obsession, secrecy, and denial. She realized that the horrors she carried in her blood were a reflection of choices made in desperation, fear, and sometimes perversely in pride. Her father, whose face she had never seen, whose presence she had never known, was more than an absence. He was a symptom of a lineage that had refused to break, a lineage that prioritized preservation of blood over moral consequence. And in her reflection, she saw what generations before her had left unfinished, the proof of a life that could not escape the past. She began to retrace the steps of those who had come before her, digging into records long forgotten or deliberately hidden. Marriage licenses, birth certificates, court documents. Every item told the same story in slightly different ways. Names repeated across generations, often with slight variations, hinting at the same familial connections that had been maintained through secrecy and silence. There was a rhythm to it, a quiet pattern, and in recognizing it, she could almost hear the pulse of her ancestors echoing across the decades. As she traced these threads, the weight of her discovery pressed upon her. She had become not just a daughter who never knew her father, but a chronicler of a lineage built upon fear and obsession. She recorded the names, the dates, the unions, the disappearances, everything. It was a methodical process, almost ritualistic, and in it, she confronted the intimate cruelty of secrecy, the way generations had silenced themselves to maintain appearances, the way love had been corrupted into control, and the way innocence had been compromised by choices they could not admit, even to themselves. Her mother's role, once opaque, began to reveal its complexity. She was at once a victim and a participant, bound by circumstance and by her own choices. The act that had led to her daughter's birth was not a single moment of weakness, but the culmination of a lifetime of complicity, denial, and fear. And in seeing this, the daughter began to understand the cyclical nature of trauma, how one generation's concealment becomes the next generation's reality, how silence perpetuates itself until it becomes indistinguishable from nature. There were moments when the weight of this history became almost unbearable. Alone in the house at night, she would stare at the old family portraits and feel the eyes of the past upon her. Faces frozen in oil and paper seemed to judge her, to demand recognition of the acts committed in their names, and yet there was also a strange intimacy in these moments. She was not merely a passive inheritor of history, She was an active participant in its reckoning. By bearing witness, by naming what had been hidden, she became both archivist and survivor, confronting horrors most would never imagine. Her investigations revealed more than just incestuous patterns. They uncovered layers of neglect, secrecy, and moral compromise that had shaped the community around her. Neighbors, friends, even local institutions had either ignored or actively concealed evidence of familial corruption. There were whispers of other children like her, children whose origins were cloaked in shame and secrecy. Each discovery deepened her understanding of how pervasive the problem was, how the architecture of concealment had been built carefully, deliberately, over generations. In the quiet hours, she reflected on her own identity. Who was she, truly, beyond the accumulation of these inherited sins? How much of herself belonged to the person she had been born to be, and how much was the unavoidable imprint of a lineage she had never chosen? Every relationship, every decision, every thought was filtered through the lens of what she now knew. She could not separate herself from the patterns that had shaped her, yet she refused to let them dictate her entirely. Knowledge, she realized, could be both a prison and a shield. There were nights when she imagined confronting her father, the man she never knew, if only to demand an explanation. But the truth was more complex. He was both a real person and a symbol of all that had been hidden, all that had been denied. Pursuing him would not provide closure. It would only confront her with the enormity of history's cruelty. And in that realization, she understood that some truths are not meant to be solved in the conventional sense. Some truths are meant to be lived with, digested slowly, their presence a constant reminder of the shadows lurking in human choice. Her journey forced her to consider the nature of morality, of secrecy, of blood itself. How do we reconcile love with harm when they are entangled so completely? How do we navigate relationships when the architecture of our existence is built upon taboos we cannot escape? Each day brought new revelations, subtle and sharp, that made her question not only her family, but the broader world around her. The town, the region, even the country, all were shaped, to some degree, by the same forces she had uncovered: fear, secrecy, and the compulsion to maintain appearances at any cost. There were moments of quiet horror when she realized that her own reflection bore witness to centuries of repetition. Her features, her health, her mannerisms, all were echoing the past. In a sense, she was both the result and the observer of the family's choices. And in that dual role, she felt a profound solitude. She could not share her understanding fully with anyone, for the truth was too grotesque, too disturbing, and the consequences of disclosure too dangerous. She was a keeper of forbidden knowledge, and like all such keepers, she bore it in silence. As she pieced together the final fragments of her family history, the picture that emerged was harrowing. Generations of women and men, bound by love, fear, and compulsion, had produced a legacy of isolation, secrecy, and suffering. Her life was not a deviation, but an apex, the culmination of patterns that had been hidden beneath polite society for decades. And in confronting this, she found a dark sort of clarity. Understanding the past, even when it is horrifying, is a way to assert control over it. Bearing witness is a way to endure it. She realized that her father's absence had not been accidental, nor had it been merely shameful. It was part of a system, a network of secrecy and compulsion that had been cultivated carefully, hidden beneath normalcy, beneath the rhythms of everyday life. And her own existence was proof of both the persistence of that system and its inescapable consequences. Every reflection in the mirror, every subtle echo of family traits, Every inherited quirk was a message from the past, a warning and a revelation rolled into one. And so, she chose a path of observation rather than participation. She documented, she catalogued, she bore witness. The knowledge she possessed was a weapon and a burden, a constant reminder of what generations before her had sought to hide. She understood that some sins cannot be undone, that some patterns cannot be broken, and that the weight of history is often most acutely felt in those who carry its blood. Her life became an archive, a living record of secrets too dark for the world to acknowledge. In the end, she realized that to know the truth was to accept a kind of loneliness few could comprehend. She walked through the town, she spoke with neighbors, she existed in the present, but her mind was always partly in the past, tracing the lineage of hidden choices, haunted by what had been concealed. And in that haunting, she found purpose, to exist, to remember, to witness. These became acts of defiance against a history that had tried to erase itself, against a bloodline that had sought to remain hidden. She understood, finally, that some families carry their sins openly, while others conceal them for generations. But concealment does not erase consequence. It only delays the reckoning. And she, the daughter who never knew her father, the product of generations of secrecy and obsession, had become that reckoning. She bore the truth silently, meticulously, a historian of her own blood, a witness to the hidden horrors that ordinary eyes would never see, a living archive of forbidden history. Her story is not just her own. It is a reflection of what lies beneath the surface in countless towns, in countless families, in countless lives. It is a warning, a testament, and a chronicle. And though she may walk among us unnoticed, her presence is a reminder that the past is never truly gone, that blood remembers, and that some truths, no matter how horrifying, will always find their way to light.